Hi, it's Yetta Decker and Ken Decker with the Inside Track on Real Estate, and we're so glad you're joining us once again, or maybe it's the first time you're watching, and you can expect to be...
listening.
Or listening. You can expect to have a new show produced every week, so if you want to check out some of the old shows, just go to deckerteam.com or chri.ca if you want to hear them. And today we're going to talk about being a landlord. So if you are a landlord, you want to stay tuned. And if you're a tenant, you'll want to stay tuned. And if you're even thinking about investing in real estate, you'll want to stay tuned. So basically, you want to stay tuned. So anyway, the top 15 things a landlord needs to consider for finding and keeping a great tenant is what we're going to chat about today. So Ken.
Yes, Yetta.
Number one.
Number one is create a price on your rental property that is fair market.
Okay.
Something that's going to attract a number of potential tenants. Because the bigger pool of tenants you have, the easier it is to select the great ones.
Exactly. So that would be the biggest reason. And then number two is once you've got that big pool of potential tenants, then it's really the screening process. Who are they? You want to see some picture ID. You'll want to do a credit check. You'll probably even want to, if possible, pop by their current place of rent just to pick up something or to deliver something, just because then you can see how they're living in their current accommodation. People often have a perspective about who they are and how they live that's very different from how you might perceive or understand it to be. So popping by can be a fantastic tool and something that's often overlooked. And then also when you're calling to verify whether they pay on time and that sort of stuff, I would encourage you not to call the current landlord, but in fact call a landlord one or two ago. Because
really?
Yeah.
And why would you say that?
Well, because the guy that's got them right now in their rental accommodation might be wanting to get rid of them. And therefore may not tell you everything you need to know to make a great decision. Whereas somebody that's already had them in the past likely has no reason not to tell you everything they know.
Right. And you know what another way is?
What's another way?
Google them. It's unbelievable what people will put on the internet about themselves or on Facebook or whatever. I've even heard of people showing them damaging rental properties and thinking it's funny and putting it on Facebook.
Right.
And so you can also see great families on Facebook, like a lot of times their personality will come out on there. So a great thing to do is Google them, see what you can find out about them.
Right, because you want to make a great decision. Ultimately, the screening process is really the one most vital piece, short of having many to select from, because if you've only got one to select from, then it's pretty tough to probably find a great one. So you want to be able to pick a great tenant because that's the best way to avoid challenges down the road.
Okay, so to be able to do a credit check, there's some things I need. I need to, first of all, have their signature on a rental application that says that I'm allowed to authorized to do that credit check.
Correct.
And then I'll need a driver's license or a social insurance number or something like that. And the best thing to do is get that driver's license because it's got the picture ID on it. And you can make sure that the person that you're doing the credit check on is actually the person that's standing in front of you and is going to be renting the property from you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And number three. It is important, vital, not to be afraid to say no, thank you. Not to be able to, you've got to be able to say no, not to be so attached to getting a tenant in there that you say yes to somebody that really is not an ideal candidate for your property or to be a tenant for you. So a vacancy is way less expensive than damage to a property or non-payment of rent. So just the ability to say no.
Yeah, and no really is next.
Right.
Find the next tenant that's going to be a good tenant for you.
A great tenant. I only want great ones in our properties. In the past, we've sometimes agreed on a tenant simply because we felt bad for them, and all indicators were that their history, their previous method of payment, their just what we knew about them made us say no, it's a bad idea, and yet we felt sad or empathetic toward them, and we went ahead and accepted them as tenants anyway. And often, it's not worked out so well.
Right. And number 4 is don't be afraid to, at the end of the lease term, either ask for another lease period, another year at a time, or because a lease automatically rolls into a month-to-month agreement if you don't sign another lease. Now they're not obligated to sign another lease under the Tenant Protection Act. But sometimes they want to because there's less opportunity for you to actually kick them out if they're in a lease than if their lease is expired and they're on a month-to-month after that. The other thing you want to do is update all your information, their personal contact information. People change cell phones. People change employers. All kinds of things happen. And if you're relying on old, outdated information, it might be that they've been a tenant for 5 years, and then they suddenly disappear or stop paying the rent or something, and you don't have current contacts or current next of kin or something, you could be snookered and not be able to find out where they are, how to reach them, how to get money from them, or to find out even if they're still in the rental property.
Exactly. Number 5 would create a simple payment method for the actual payment of the rent, maybe a pre-authorized or post-dated checks, just something that makes it very easy. So every month you're not chasing down the tenant and then there's reasons that maybe they can't be reached or whatever. So just create a simple payment method and that'll alleviate all kinds of challenges down the road.
So it's important to know that you can ask for post-dated checks, but there is no obligation on the tenant's part to provide post-dated checks. You cannot demand it under the Tenant Protection Act. Also, the other thing that modern day payment methods are so easy, they could set you up as a payee on their account and automatically deposit money into your account each month. The other way is they can email money. It's the coolest thing. Emailing money is really, if you've never done it, you got to try it, because you send an email and suddenly they got money in their bank account. It's
out of yours.
And it comes out of yours. It's the coolest thing. But if you're into online banking, then you probably know about email transfers, and that's a great way to have your tenant pay. Because if you have to keep tracking them down, going to the property, knocking on the door on payday, and maybe they're not there, and it just becomes a headache. There needs to be a simple, easy method.
Right. And number 6, we can't take deposits or damage deposits in Ontario, which makes it just a little more challenging to determine how do we ensure that our property is maintained well. So Ken has a great strategy on ensuring or creating an atmosphere that makes the buyer, or the tenant rather, want to take care of the property. What is that, Ken?
Well, so the maximum rent is 1 month's rent, one last month's rent. And the problem is the last month's rent is used up in the last month. And then when they move out, you have absolutely no security deposit at all. So my thought on it is to redo a property that's been damaged by a tenant is very expensive. So I give a rebate. So in other words, let's say rent is $1,600 typically for a property like that. I might say, okay, your rent is $1,600, and I'll write into the lease that at the end of their move-out date, I will verify the condition of the property, and if there's no damage other than normal wear and tear kind of stuff, then I'm going to rebate $50 per month that they've actually stayed there. So if they've stayed for 2 years, that could be $1,200 rebate back to the tenant for keeping the property in good condition. That's a good incentive.
Yeah, and it's an inexpensive way to ensure that your property is going to be in great shape.
Because really, it's a big investment. You might spend $200,000, $300,000 on a property, and you'd like it to be looked after.
Right.
And so, a few $100 or even a couple $1,000 is a little expense to make sure your property's cared for.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been helpful for us now that we figured out how to do that.
Yeah.
So, number 7.
Number 7, if the market is down and you have rent control on your property, and we're going to talk about rent control in another point, but if there's rent control, that means you can't raise the rent very much. And so if you have to reduce the rent to get your property filled, I recommend doing an early signing bonus or a move-in bonus so that the rent is still, let's use that $1,600 number. Your rent's $1,600, but because you're moving in right away, we're going to give you an early signing bonus, and your rent, we're going to deduct $100 a month. So for the first year, your rent is going to be $1,500 a month, and it'll resort back to $1,600 at the end of the lease because that was an early signing bonus, and the actual rent established is $1,600.
Right, and that's a way of maintaining your established rent, where if you simply change the rent to $1,500, if you are under control of the rent control increases, then you can't go back to $1,600.
That's right.
You're stuck at the $1,500. So the best way to deal with it is simply do it as an early signing bonus or an incentive in relation to moving in.
Right. So number 8 is don't be absent. Because I've seen horror stories with absentee landlords that rent a property because they're moving out of country or out of province or whatever. No one ever comes to check on the property, and that's when they're open for weird things like grow-ops happening, properties being not maintained properly, roof starting to leak, and all kinds of things like that.
Right, and now if you are not available there, as long as you have a great property manager, that would still make you an available landlord. So it doesn't have to be you, it can be a representative, but someone viewing the property and just being available, connecting with the tenants on an occasional basis, that would create a huge contrast between what could happen and just what won't happen when you're involved.
Yeah, so another part of being not absent is maintaining your property. So I build into my lease agreement scheduled maintenance issues, like going in to change the air filter on the furnace. One time to change the batteries in the smoke detector and the battery in the thermostat for your furnace. To go and check the roof for the caulking, the winter check before winter comes. Check your caulking around the house, check your roof, empty the gutters, all that kind of thing. So that you're coming into the house regularly. That will make sure that people are maintaining your home properly, and you'll have a sense of what they're doing. And if they're not maintaining it properly, then you can start doing the corrective thing, like evicting and that sort of thing.
Right. So if you're just joining us now, this is the Inside Track on Real Estate with the Decker team, and today we're talking about the top 15 things a landlord can do to ensure they have a great tenant and that they keep a great tenant. So Ken, number
9. Number 9, have a late fee. If they're not going to pay their rent on time, have a late fee. The other thing I do is I make sure that my mortgage payment comes out on the 15th so that I have some time to get my rent, because typically your rents are due on the 1st and you want to make sure your money's coming in. A day or two is not bad, but usually if you have a late fee, if it's not in by the second day, and adhere to that. So if they don't pay their rent on time, charge the extra $25 or $50 and have an NSF fee. So if they write a check and the check bounces, know that the next one needs to be a certified check or a money draft, or they got to deposit the money directly into your account, and you're going to charge them for that NSF, probably $25 or $50. Put it right in the lease. And then I find if you're about 4 days late, start the process. Go onto the Tenant Protection Board website. There's all the forms are there for notifications to the tenant and for the tenant to notify the landlord. You're going to use an N4, and an N4 is a notice that you're going to apply for eviction, and you have to give them 14 days notice to correct the rent thing. So where most landlords fall down is they go, oh, well, okay, I still got my last month's rent, it's not too bad, I'll wait, and I think they're going to catch up, and then you get a month behind, and then 2 months behind, and then they go, oh, well, better learn how to do the process, and then they give notice, and suddenly it's 3 months before they can get a tenant out. So they've had 3 months no rent. Probably that tenant's not looking after the property if they're not paying it either. So now that's the thing I can suggest is get your notice in right away when they're not paying rent.
And that's Form N4.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And number 10, rent increases. What can I do? What am I regulated by? What are my...
Okay.
Yeah, what can I do as a landlord?
Right. As a landlord, you have some rights under the Tenant Protection Act, even though it's called the Tenant Protection Act. It's designed to protect
It's important to catch that.
tenants. You do have some rights under that. One is that you can give rent increases only once a year. So if it's been 9 months, you can't give another rent increase until it's 12 months or up. Most people do them at the end of the lease. So if you're a 12-month lease, do your rent increase. And all I can suggest is do your rent increase. Even if it's 2012 the rental increase maximum amount was 3.1% for properties that are under rent control. And you may hear me say, well, properties that are under rent control. What determines whether property is under rent control or not is when it was built and first occupied. So if it was occupied prior to November 1st, 1991, rent control applies to that property. If it was built and occupied after November 1st, 1991, rent control does not apply to that property, and the landlord could increase the rent any percentage they wanted, right,
provided the market allows for it.
Up to market rent. And if the tenant decides, well, I don't like that, then they have the option to leave. Now, you must give 90 days written notice on your form. I can't remember the form number, but anyways, go to the tenant board, and all the forms are on there. You want to give 90 days notice, because that gives the tenant 30 days to decide whether they're staying, or they're going to give you your 60-day notice that they're required to do, that they're vacating.
Yeah, I believe it's Form N9.
And these are all based on monthly and year, like tenancies that is a year tenancy with a monthly payment. If you have weekly payment or daily payment, all these rules change.
Right. Now, a deficiency report is a great way to ensure you know you've got a great tenant, and that's simply when they move in. On move-in, you do a thorough investigation and walkthrough with the tenant, the new tenant, and write down everything that is not perfect in the property, things that you're going to repair, things that are going to be left that way, so that you've got a reference. And even taking pictures now with the digital age, it is so easy to take pictures of anything that's deficient, and therefore you've got history and record, and that damage deposit, which I know isn't really a damage deposit, but cared for property, a well cared for maintenance rebate, that would be based on how things looked when they moved out. So having a good, thorough list and photographs, deficiency list, when they move in, will really aid you significantly in that area.
Yeah, and the tenant is to sign those and date those documents. It's similar if you're renting a car. They're going to do a check around the car. You're going to initial where there's dings or dents, so that when you bring it back, if there's a big crunch in the fender, you can't say, well, that was there when I rented it. And it's the same thing with your rental property. You want to have that ability and pictures and say, look, the kitchen cupboard door was not ripped off when you rented it. It was still attached. So you're going to pay for the repair of that.
Right, or you're not going to get your maintenance rebate back.
And just because you have a maintenance rebate doesn't mean you can't go after the tenant for willful damage to your property. You can still go to small claims court and request payment for that. I've had to do that in one case. And that particular person had a good job with the government, and the courts just garnished her wages for, took about a year for me to get the damage money back, but I did get it all back.
Yeah, so that's helpful. We did talk a little bit about maximum deposit already, but just a reminder that the maximum deposit you can take on a lease is first and last month's rent. You can't take a damage deposit, so when we keep referring to it, what we're talking about is the maintenance rebate.
Yeah, and you also can't even take extra deposit for keys, for instance. The maximum amount is the last month's rent.
In Ontario. Right. It varies from province to province and state to state and throughout the world, but in Ontario, that is how we're regulated under the Tenant Protection Act.
Yes, and also that stipulates a percentage that you must pay on that last month's rent as interest on a yearly basis. Some people do it yearly. Some just tack it on to the year, to the deposit, because the rent's gone up. So your last month's deposit now is going up because of the interest that you're adding to it. And it kind of tracks along. And then at the end of when they do decide to leave, the last month's rent is enough. And if you owe them any more, you have to give them that interest when they're leaving.
Absolutely. Now, pets, that's another interesting topic. So what can we do or what can we not do as a landlord around pets? I know that we can ask in our original lease that there not be pets.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, you can stipulate that it's a pet-free building. You can discriminate on a tenant because they have a pet. So if they say, yeah, I've got a snake or a cat or whatever it is, you can say, well, thank you, I don't want to rent to you. But if a tenant is actually in the building and then you find out that they have an animal, you cannot require them to leave unless that animal is A, disturbing other people, or B, causing damage to the property, and you can prove that they're damaging the property. Then you can evict the tenant for that.
Right.
The other thing that's important to know with pets is you can request that they are veterinarian certified, that they're not animals that would harm another person, that they have their shots up to date, that they have their flea shots or collars or whatever, so that your building doesn't get fleas. So there are some stipulations you can do with pets. The other thing that's important to know is if your property is a condominium and the condominium corporation says that it has a zero tolerance for pets, then you can put that into your lease, and it is steadfast because of the condominium, not under the Tenant Act, but under the Condominium Act. The condominium can ask that person to leave because of the pets.
Right.
So that's an important
distinction. So the Condominium Act takes precedence over the Tenant Protection Act.
Yes, because it's the actual property that affects that.
Right. Now, if someone were to not have pets when they moved in, and then after they moved in, obtained a pet, unless that pet was doing damage, the pet stays.
That's right. So does the tenant.
So does the tenant. The tenant and the pet stay.
Yes.
So number 14 is use the correct forms. We've given you an idea of a few of the form numbers right now. It's landlord tenant board is where you're going to find the forms, and it's just, there's nothing more important than doing the right paperwork, because then there is no loophole on behalf of the tenant to get out of something. If you're not, if it's not working well, at least if you're using the forms as they're intended to be used, signing them as they're intended to be signed, initialing things where they're intended to be initialed, then you have protected yourself at least as far as somebody operating within the law.
Now, number 15 is a great one, and it's simple. I just simply print off Form N9, and N9 is the tenant's notice to the landlord that they're going to vacate. And it's a 2 months notice again, and it's 2 calendar months notice. We call it 60 days, but it's actually 2 calendar months if you're on a monthly lease where you pay monthly. That N9, I print it out and I attach it to the lease, and I say, keep your lease somewhere safe. Here's your notice. Whenever you decide it's time for you to leave, take this off, fill it out, and present it to me. And anytime you're giving notices, the board requires that there's time for them to receive it. So it's fine if you actually give it to them and you hand deliver and you take note, or they sign that they've received it. Now you know that they've got it and the 60 days begins. But if you're going to mail it or slip it under the door or some other method like that, they say we're going to add days to that notice period so that there's time for the tenant to actually receive it. So just be careful there. And then know the law. Know the law. If you're going to get into buying investment properties, being a landlord, renting to tenants, you're really starting a side business. You're opening a business. And knowing what you're doing is highly important. And then hiring professionals. I always say that hiring professionals, you now have a business, you should have a great accountant.
Right.
You should have a great lawyer. You should have a great realtor. And realtors are great to find tenants for your properties as well. Yeah, they charge you a little bit of the rent to find a great tenant for you, but typically they're going to search for the tenant, they're going to screen the tenant, they're going to do the reference check, and then you're going to have the final decision whether that's a tenant that you want.
And they're going to facilitate the credit check as well.
Yeah, they're going to
assist you in understanding what that credit check means. Because if you haven't seen very many of them, they can be a little bit confusing.
Yeah, and the other professional you may decide to hire is if you don't want to get those phone calls in the middle of the night, my toilet's leaking or whatever it may be, and you don't want to have to go collect rent, and you don't want to have to say no to potential tenants, and you don't want to have confrontation with tenants, then my suggestion is hire a great property manager.
Yeah.
And there's some great ones out there that will look after all of those things for you. It'll cost you some money, so your return on your investment may be a little less, but then your hands-on is a lot less. So we can sit down together and discuss that, what might be the best thing for your particular situation as an investor. And that's all part of your plan for building wealth in real estate.
That's right. And it may be easier to maintain or have a property manager when you also have more units. When you have more doors, then it becomes per door a little less expensive, and it also becomes just more necessary probably to have a property manager. So if you've been listening today and you've thought, well, this still sounds interesting, I'm intrigued about the whole idea of owning property, and I'm currently not a landlord, but it doesn't sound as daunting or terrible as maybe some of the horror stories I've heard, then I would encourage you to join us at our investor workshop. We teach you the 8 pitfalls that a savvy investor avoids when they're purchasing rental property and investment in general in real estate. So that is on the second Thursday of every month, and that is facilitated generally by Ken or one of our other investor experts. And that is at 1 Antares in the city of Ottawa. If you would like to join us, it is important that you RSVP because we want to ensure we have enough seats set up and that we're organized and prepared for you. And so you can reach us at 613-860-4663. That's 860-HOME, or through info@deckerteam.com. You can register there as well. And it would be great to have you join us. And feel free to bring out people that haven't heard this show, people that may be intrigued just to know more about investing in real estate. It's an amazing opportunity to get a really good overview of what is involved, not just in this type of investing, but all types of real estate investing. And so that would be the second Thursday of every month. So Ken, what parting words would you have for anybody that is currently a landlord? What do they need to know?
Parting words. Just know the law. It's know the law. It has protection methods and mechanisms in there for the landlord and for the tenant, and you have responsibilities to the tenant that you need to uphold. And so just know what your responsibilities are, know what their responsibilities are, and hold them to it. And this thing can be a cakewalk. It can be a nightmare, but it can be a cakewalk. And pretty much every time I've seen a nightmare, it's because they didn't know what they were getting into, they didn't understand their rights, and they didn't know what to do when something went wrong.
And therefore they didn't follow the procedures.
Right,
so
exactly.
Once you know, I guess the second half is doing what you know.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. So you've been listening to the Inside Track on Real Estate with the Decker team. We hope today's been useful, learning the top 15 tips for landlords for finding a great tenant
and keeping a
them.
great tenant. Yeah.
So thanks for joining us. If you have questions that you'd like answered, give us a call at 613-860-4663 or send an email to deckerteam@chri.ca. And that's it for today. Bye for now.
Thanks for joining us.